Judging the quality of assessment. So when you are judging the quality of the assessment that you're looking at in front of you, there are a number of different points to consider. The first one is planning. Was there effective assessment planning with the learner by the assessor before the assessment occurred? Obviously, you can look at the planning that the assessor has done, read through the planning documentation, and also you might be able to interview the learner and discuss it with them as well to find out if they were happy with the level of planning that they are doing prior to their assessments. Are the learners being briefed before undertaking assessment? So the planning has been done and the learner has turned up for their assessment, whatever that happens to be. Are they receiving a small briefing just prior to starting their assessment? It's useful for learners to be briefed at this point because it can settle them down, focus their mind, and get them back into the mode of understanding what it is they're just about to do. In fact, I would also say, are the learners aware they are even in assessment at any point? And a briefing provides the actual sort of line to be drawn from when they are not in assessment to when they are now in an assessment. Has the appropriate assessment method been selected? Some qualifications will specify certain types of assessment methods, whether that's observations or written questions and so on. Other qualifications will allow you to choose depending on the particular situation you have been faced. So as an IQA, one of the judgments you'll be trying to make of your assessors is whether they have chosen an appropriate way of assessing the evidence or creating evidence with the learner for the qualification or unit or outcome that they're doing. A simple example would be the difference between a knowledge or understanding outcome and a competence or a being able to outcome. Usually, with knowledge and understanding outcomes, criteria can be answered in the style of a question and answer. Whereas with be able to or competence type outcomes, they need to actually see live evidence of the person or the learner actually doing what it is to show their competence. And a way of looking at that is you can't use their verbal questioning to cover a competence criteria. So the question then becomes, has the appropriate assessment method been selected? Another question you will ask is whether the evidence you are seeing is VARCS or VARCS, which is valid, authentic, reliable, current and sufficient, and we'll have a little bit of a closer look at that in more detail shortly. The next point is, has the correct decision been made, fundamentally, and has the decision the assessor has made been recorded clearly? Is it clear to the learner what the outcome was of the assessment? Have they passed it? Have they been referred on it? Have they passed parts of it and need to actually undertake actions and activities to be ready to have a go again at the rest of it? So has the correct decision been made firstly by the assessor? Do you agree with and are able to support their decisions? And has that decision been correctly recorded? Now, once the assessor has made that decision, have they provided both verbal and written feedback to the learner? Can you read their verbal feedback? Does it apply to the assessment and the evidence of the assessment that you are reading? Does what they've written down, make sense and justify their decision? Is there any evidence that the learners are receiving this feedback in verbal form as well as in written form? Also, importantly for compliance and monitoring purposes, is whether the assessor has completed all the paperwork and all the administration fully and accurately, and is it all current and correct? This can be crucial, especially when external quality assurers come out and do their compliance and monitoring. Now, just to put this in context, remember there are lots of different methods of assessment, whether that's observation, professional discussion, verbal and written questions, witness testimony, simulation, work products, case studies and projects, and assignments. So when you are making your judgments, taking into account the different methods of assessment and the certain environments and conditions that they all need is really an important part of that. So when the assessor has made their judgment, what you do hope is that they have incorporated whether the evidence that they are assessing is valid, authentic, reliable, current and sufficient. So what do we mean by this? Well, this is really a refresher from your assessor training, so it should really just be a nice little bit of short revision for you. So when we're talking about evidence being valid, first of all we're saying, is it a recognised assessment method? Is it one that we can use in this qualification? Is it valid against the type of criteria and outcome? We mentioned before the difference between knowledge outcomes or understand outcomes and being able to or competency outcomes. And the problem that arises if you try to cover competency outcomes based on knowledge. So is it a recognised and correct or suitable assessment method? And does the activity being assessed relate to the qualification and the assessment criteria? So occasionally it happens that you'll have evidence in the file that doesn't seem to quite be relevant to the unit or the criteria or the outcome that you are looking at. Next, in our making evidence solid, we want to know that the evidence is authentic, that it's basically the learner's own work and that this can be proved. Think of different ways that that can be proved. I mean, if it's a recording of a discussion, is it the learner's voice that you can hear? If it's written questions, do you have signature strips that have been signed and so on? Often with electronic portfolio systems, passwords and login details are unique to the particular learner and therefore also show authenticity. Next, is the evidence reliable? So can the learner repeat the activity or skill, or did they just manage to fluke it in a one-off? Is there more than one example of the learner doing this activity or demonstrating this skill? Can the learner apply the skill to different situations or contexts? This might be required by the criteria or the outcomes within the qualification. And making sure that you and the assessor have access to the correct qualification specification is vital, as some qualifications make it overtly explicit as to how many times the learner has to do something to show their competence. The next is whether the evidence is current and whether the evidence is a reflection of the current level of skill and knowledge that the learner has, and whether within the qualification specification or other awarding organisation requirements there are any restrictions on how old evidence can be. Next is whether evidence is sufficient, and this is the big one really. Is the evidence sufficient to cover the criteria and the outcomes targeted? Does the evidence explicitly show how the learner achieved the criteria? And has a holistic approach been adopted? Hopefully the days of one piece of evidence per criteria are a long way behind us. However, for newer assessors or trainee assessors, they may need help and support and to build their confidence in being able to apply a holistic approach across a qualification. So all these different aspects of being valid, authentic, reliable, current and sufficient helps to make evidence solid. Now just to make a point and just to remember that IQA or internal quality assurance is not a second assessment. Countersigning is really a second assessment. However, whilst IQA is a checking of assessment practice generally, in order to be able to confirm the assessor's decisions are correct, you will need to dip in and see the evidence yourself. Where there are less experienced assessors, this dipping in will need to increase in response to the higher risk level that is present. And this is where planning and preparation are vital. It means that you can, as far as possible, ensure that your IQA is targeted and prioritised to where it is needed.